Have you ever imagined losing everything overnight, and at just 11 years old, you're forced to become a parent to your own siblings? My name doesn't matter because this story could be anyone's. But there's one thing you need to know. At 11 years old, my childhood ended with a phone call I never wanted to receive. It was an ordinary afternoon until the door opened, and adults walked in with eyes I couldn't understand. They said many things, but I only heard one: my parents were gone. A car accident. Those two words shattered my small world into pieces. I didn't cry right away. I just stood there looking at my two younger siblings laughing in the corner, and in that moment, I realized I no longer had the right to be weak. That night I didn't sleep. I lay between them, listening to their breathing, asking myself, what happens tomorrow? There was no answer, no guidance. Just me, a child facing a world that suddenly became too big. The days that followed were a brutal lesson in growing up. I learned to cook my first meals with trembling hands. I learned to hide my tears so my siblings wouldn't panic. I learned to say everything will be okay, even when I didn't believe it myself. School was no longer a place of joy. It became a place where I tried not to break down in public. I watched other kids being picked up by their parents while I rushed home to make sure my siblings had eaten. Some nights, I sat in the dark, counting the little money we had left, wondering if we would have enough for the next day. There were moments I wanted to scream, to ask why me? Why my family? But every time I saw my siblings sleeping peacefully, I swallowed it all. I wasn't allowed to fall apart. I wasn't a child anymore. I was the only one they had. As time passed, I lost track of how many things, and one year old, should have experienced, but didn't. No games, no carefree days, just responsibility, fear, and a quiet determination to survive and keep this little family from falling apart. And then I realized something: strength isn't about being fearless. It's about moving forward even when you're terrified. If you're listening to this, remember there are children out there forced to grow up too soon. And if you still have your family, never take that for granted. If this story moved, you hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Comment below. Family is everything, if you truly believe it. At 11 years old, you're supposed to worry about homework and games, but I had to learn how to keep my family alive after a single accident took everything away. I still remember that day clearly. The sky was just as blue. As always, everything felt normal, so normal that no one could have imagined how within hours my life would change forever. When the news came, I didn't fully understand it at first. Adults were talking, but my mind went blank. A car accident. My parents. Gone. I stood there feeling like the ground beneath me had disappeared. But what terrified me most wasn't the loss. It was the silence that followed, when I looked at my two younger siblings, who were too young to understand what had just happened. In that moment, I knew I had no choice. I had to be strong, even though no one had ever taught me how. The days that followed felt like a nightmare that wouldn't end. Every morning I woke up with the same question: what do I need to do today so we don't fall apart? No one had the answer. No one showed me the way. I started with the smallest things: cooking, cleaning, helping with homework, trying to make everything seem normal, even though I was breaking inside. There were times I burned entire meals, and my siblings still ate without complaining. That broke my heart and made me more determined. I began to understand that even though I was only 11 to them, I was everything. School became another battle. I couldn't focus on lessons. I was thinking about what we would eat that night, whether we had enough money, and whether anyone would notice. I was pretending to be an adult. Some days I was so exhausted I just wanted to give up, to run away from everything. But then I would see the way my siblings looked at me, trusting, depending on me with no other choice, and I knew I couldn't fail. Not because I was stronger than others, but because I wasn't allowed to be weak. As time passed, I learned how to endure, how to hide my fear, and how to stand, even when everything inside me was shaking. I was no longer the child who dreamed of simple things. I became the backbone of the family, a role I never chose but had to carry. And somehow, through all the hardship, the bond between us grew stronger than ever. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And sometimes that's the only thing that keeps you going. If you're listening to this story, remember there are people out there fighting every single day just to survive. And if you still have your family by your side, cherish every moment, because you never know when everything could change forever. When did your childhood end? For me, it ended at 11 the moment I realized no one was coming to protect us anymore. I used to think childhood would last forever, afternoons filled with laughter, peaceful sleep, and the comfort of knowing someone was always there to protect me. But all of that disappeared in a single day. When the accident happened, I didn't just lose my parents. I lost the right to be a child. Everything came too fast, too cold. The condolences, the pity in people's eyes, and then silence. No more familiar voices in the house. No one calling my name in the morning, just me and my two younger siblings, small, confused, and completely dependent on me when I didn't even know what to do next. I remember the first night after everything, when the house felt so unfamiliar, it was terrifying. I sat in the living room looking around as if waiting for a miracle, waiting for everything to go back to the way it was. But no miracle came. Only reality, that I had to stand up even though I wasn't ready. The next day, I started doing things I had never imagined I would have to do. I opened the fridge, trying to find something I could cook. I checked my siblings' school bags, asked them questions my parents used to ask. I said words of comfort I didn't even believe myself. And little by little, I realized I was becoming someone I had never imagined, an adult trapped in a child's body. There were moments when it felt like I was living two lives at once. During the day, I tried to be a normal student sitting in class as if nothing had happened. At night, I was the one worrying about meals, bills, and fears I couldn't share with anyone. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was mental. The kind that comes from having to be strong when all you want is someone to hold you and say everything will be okay. There were days I almost broke. I asked myself why this was happening, why a child had to carry so much. But every time I looked at my siblings, the way they held my hand, the way they called my name with absolute trust, I stood back up. Not because I wasn't afraid, but because I couldn't let them be afraid. Slowly, I learned to live with the pain, not by forgetting it, but by carrying it and still moving forward. I was no longer the child I once was, but I wasn't fully an adult either. I was somewhere in between, a place where I had to create my own strength. And the only thing that kept me going was my love for my siblings, a force stronger than fear, stronger than loss itself. If you're listening to this story, remember there are people who had to grow up too soon, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. And if you still have the chance to be a child, to be protected, cherish it before it's gone. There are days you're still just a child, and then in a single moment, you become the only person your family has left to lean on. I never thought my life would take this path, and I definitely didn't think it would happen so early, when I was only 11 years old. The accident came without warning, like a storm that swept away everything I once called peace. People talk a lot about the pain of losing loved ones, but no one tells you what it feels like to suddenly have to replace them. That day, I didn't just lose my parents. I became the only adult in that house. I still remember the look in my siblings' eyes when they started to realize something was wrong. Not fully understanding, but feeling the absence. They looked at me as if waiting for an answer I didn't have. And in that moment, I understood that whether I was ready or not, I had to become that answer. The first days were a whirlwind of emotions: pain, fear, confusion. But above all, there was responsibility, something that weighed on me every second. I began doing things I had never even noticed before: managing money, preparing meals, making sure my siblings went to school. Every small action felt like a step on a path I had never been prepared for. There were times I stood in the kitchen not knowing what to do next, only knowing that if I stopped, everything would fall apart. School was no longer a place I could relax. I sat in class, but my mind was always at home. I worried about whether my siblings were okay, whether something might happen while I wasn't there. I began to understand what it meant to be an adult, when responsibility doesn't let you rest, when worry follows you everywhere. There were nights I stayed awake not because of homework, but because of fear of the future. I wondered how long I could keep going, whether I was strong enough to hold everything together. There were moments I wanted to break down, to go back to being a normal child, to have someone hold me and say everything would be okay. But the truth was, there was no one left to do that, and that truth forced me to stand up again and again. The only thing that kept me going was my siblings, their laughter, their trust in me without question. I couldn't let them see me weak, not because I didn't have the right to be, but because they needed someone strong to lean on. Slowly, I learned to adapt, not because things got easier, but because I had no choice but to keep moving forward. I was no longer the child I used to be, but I wasn't fully an adult either. I was something in between, someone learning to survive, one day at a time. And if there's one thing I truly understand, it's this: strength isn't something you're born with. It's something you're forced to create when there's no one else left to stand for you. If you're listening to this story, remember there are people who had to become the support for their entire world before they even understood what the world was. And if you still have someone to lean on, cherish it, because not everyone gets that chance. From a carefree child, I was thrown into the role of the family's backbone overnight, and if I fell, everything would collapse with me. No one prepared me for this. There were no lessons, no plans, no one standing behind me saying I would be okay. It all started with that phone call, short, cold, and enough to destroy everything I knew. A car accident. My parents were gone. I stood frozen, unable to cry, unable to react, as if my mind refused to accept reality. But when I turned and saw my two younger siblings waiting for me, innocent, confused, something inside me changed. In that moment, I was no longer a child. I became the backbone of the family, even though I didn't even understand what that meant. The days that followed gave me no time to grieve. I didn't have the luxury to fall apart. I had to wake up early, prepare meals, check clothes, take my siblings to school, then return home to face bills. I barely understood. I learned everything in a rush, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. There were moments I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the child staring back. Those eyes didn't belong to an 1-year-old, they belonged to someone trying to survive. I began to understand that growing up isn't always a slow process. Sometimes it's a free fall you're never ready for. School became a distant place. I sat in class, but my mind was always at home. I worried about things my friends had never even considered: money, food, the future. Some days I was so exhausted, I just wanted to give up, to go back to being a normal child, to be taken care of by someone else. But every time that thought appeared, I remembered my siblings, the way they held my hand, the way they trusted me, without question. And I knew I couldn't let go, not because I was stronger than others, but because I had no other choice. Slowly, I learned to keep going, not because things became easier, but because I got used to enduring. I learned how to hide my pain, how to smile, when everything inside me was falling apart. I don't remember the last time I felt carefree, but I know one thing: I'm still standing, and my small family is still together. And maybe that's my greatest victory. If you're listening to this story, understand that some people had to sacrifice their childhood just to keep their family alive. And if you still have the chance to live carefree, cherish it, because not everyone does. If this story made you think, hit like and subscribe to support more real stories like this. Comment below, I won't give up, if you believe in your own strength. If everything you love disappears in a single day, what would you do at just 11 years old, with no one left to rely on? I used to believe that family was something permanent, strong, unbreakable. But one day everything disappeared so fast I couldn't even process what was happening. When the news of the accident came, the world around me seemed to stop. Adults were talking, neighbors came and went, but I couldn't hear anything clearly. All I felt was a massive emptiness. Something had been taken away forever. But the most terrifying moment wasn't the loss itself, it was when I looked at my two younger siblings. They didn't understand, they just knew something was wrong. And they turned to me as if I had the answers. And in that moment I realized I had no choice but to become the one holding this family together. The first night is something I will never forget. The house was so quiet it felt haunting. I sat in the middle of the room listening to every small sound as if hoping something familiar would return. But nothing did. Only reality that from now on, I had to take care of everything on my own. The next day I started with the smallest things. I opened the fridge trying to find something to cook, even though I had never really cooked before. I woke my siblings up, got them ready for school, trying to make everything look as normal as possible. But inside, I was panicking. I didn't know if I was doing anything right. I just knew I couldn't stop. There were moments I stood frozen in the kitchen, not knowing what to do next. Times when I felt too small for everything happening around me. But every time I thought about giving up, I remembered my siblings, the way they held my hand, the way they relied on me, as if I was the only safe place left. And that kept me going. School became another challenge. I tried to focus, but my mind was always back home. I wondered if everything was okay when I wasn't there. I began to understand responsibility, how it never lets you escape, whether you want to or not. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I could keep everything from falling apart. I was afraid of the future, afraid of things I couldn't control. But slowly I realized I didn't need all the answers. I just needed to keep moving forward one day at a time. I was no longer the child I used to be, but I wasn't fully an adult either. I was learning to become both at once, and the only thing that made it possible was my love for my family, a force stronger than fear, stronger than loss itself. If you're listening to this story, remember that some people have had to become the foundation of their own world before they even had the chance to grow up. And if you still have your family by your side, cherish every moment because it is the most valuable thing you have. Can you imagine? While other kids are being protected at 11 years old, you have to learn how to survive for your entire family. I used to be a normal child with small worries, homework, grades, and games after school. But all of that disappeared the day my life was split in two. When the accident happened, I didn't just lose my parents. I lost my sense of safety, something I had always taken for granted. No one told me what to do next. There were no instructions, no one to hold my hand and guide me. There was only silence, and my two younger siblings looking at me, waiting. And in that look, I understood that I wasn't allowed to be afraid, even though I was breaking inside. The first days felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I woke up every morning with a heavy weight in my chest, but I had no time to stop. I had to prepare meals even though I had never cooked before. I had to make sure my siblings got to school on time, clean the house, and handle things I had never imagined doing. There were moments I stood in the middle of the room not knowing what to do next, only knowing that if I didn't keep going, everything would fall apart. School became a place where I tried to pretend everything was okay. I sat in class staring at the board, but my mind was elsewhere at home. I thought about whether my siblings were okay, whether they felt as scared as I did. I began to understand that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about moving forward, even when you don't know where you're going. There were nights I couldn't sleep, just lying there, thinking. I wondered why this had happened, why I had to face all of this when I was so young. I wanted to cry, to give up, to go back to the life I once had. But every time I looked at my siblings, I couldn't. They needed me. And that was enough to keep me going. Slowly, I learned things no one taught me. I learned how to be strong without protection. I learned how to hide my fear so my siblings wouldn't worry. I learned how to become someone I never imagined I would be. I was no longer the child I used to be, but I wasn't fully an adult either. I was someone learning how to survive one day at a time, and the only thing keeping me standing was my love for my family, a force that couldn't be broken, even when everything else had collapsed. If you're listening to this story, remember that there are people out there fighting every day just to keep going. And if you are still protected, still have someone by your side, cherish it because not everyone gets that chance. If no one is left to guide you at 11, would you stand still? Or keep moving forward even without knowing what lies ahead? I used to think my life would follow a normal path, growing up, studying with my parents, always there behind me. But everything stopped the day the accident happened. There was no warning, no time to prepare. In a single moment, I lost the two most important people in my life, and with them, everything I depended on. I remember the emptiness I felt, as if someone had taken away my entire world. But what scared me most was when I looked at my siblings. They didn't understand what was happening, but they knew they needed someone, and their eyes stopped on me. In that moment, I realized I was no longer a child. I had to become the one who leads, even though I didn't know where the path would go. The days that followed felt like I was learning how to live all over again. I had to do things I had never imagined: cooking, cleaning, managing everything at home. Every small decision made me anxious, because I had no one to ask if I was doing it right. There were times I stood still, feeling lost in a world too big for me. But I couldn't stop because, if I did, everything would fall apart. School was no longer the same. I still went to class, sat in my seat, but my mind was always somewhere else. I thought about my siblings, about the things I needed to do, about responsibilities I should never have had at that age. I began to understand that life isn't always fair, and some people are forced to grow up faster than others. There were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering where I was going. I didn't have answers, but I knew I had to keep going. Not because I was confident, but because I had no other choice. Slowly, I learned to trust myself, not because I was always right, but because I was the only one who could decide for my family. I learned to stand even when I was shaking inside. I learned to move forward even without knowing the destination. And over time, I realized I was rewriting my life, not in the way I chose, but in the way I was forced to live. I was no longer the child who needed guidance. I became the one who guides, and the only thing that kept me from getting lost was my love for my siblings, a small light but strong enough to guide me through the darkest days. If you're listening to this story, remember that some people have had to find their own path before they even understood the world. And if you still have someone to guide you, cherish it, because not everyone gets that chance. If you lost everything at 11, would you break down or stand strong for the ones who still need you? There are moments in life you can't undo, can't fix, and can't fully understand why they happen. For me, that moment came when I was 11. A phone call, cold and brief, and my world collapsed instantly. A car accident. My parents were gone. I remember standing there as if all sound had disappeared. Nothing but an endless emptiness inside me. But then I saw my siblings. They didn't cry as much as I expected, maybe because they didn't fully understand. But their eyes, full of fear and waiting, pulled me back to reality. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't allowed to fall apart. Not because I was strong, but because I had no other choice. The first days were something I never want to relive. I was trying to understand what had happened while doing things I had never imagined before. I had to cook, clean, make sure my siblings still went to school, still lived as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. There were moments I stood in the kitchen, holding a pot, not knowing what to do next. Times when I wanted to run away from everything, but I couldn't. Because if I left, who would stay for them? School became a place where I tried to stay composed. I sat in class watching others laugh and talk, feeling like I didn't belong anymore. I carried something heavy inside me that no one could see. Some days I was completely exhausted physically and emotionally. I wanted to cry, to collapse, to let someone else carry the weight. But there was no one else, and that truth forced me to stand up again and again. The only thing that kept me going was my siblings. The way they held my hand when they were scared, the way they called my name when they needed help, it made me realize I was their only support. And no matter how afraid I was, I couldn't let them see it. Slowly, I learned how to stand strong. Not because I didn't hurt, but because I got used to enduring. I learned to keep going, even when every step was difficult. I was no longer the child I used to be, but I wasn't fully an adult either. I was someone trying to keep everything from falling apart. And maybe that's the hardest thing a child can ever do. If you're listening to this story, remember that there are people out there trying to stand strong even after losing everything. And if you still have people by your side, cherish them, because sometimes just having each other is enough. There are choices no one wants to make, but at 11 years old, I had to decide: fall apart or stand up and save my family. I don't remember exactly when I changed. Maybe it wasn't a single moment, but a series of long days, where little by little I lost pieces of my childhood. After the accident, everything felt faded, like I was living in a world without color. Adults told me I had to be strong, but no one taught me how. And then I realized strength isn't something you learn, it's something you become when there's no one else left. I stood at the edge of collapse, but behind me were my siblings. They didn't understand everything, but they knew they needed me. And that was enough to keep me from stepping back. The days that followed were about survival. I had no long-term plans, no big dreams, just one thought: how do we make it through tomorrow? I learned to cook simple meals, to save every small amount of money, to do things I had never imagined before. There were moments I wanted to give up, but I didn't have the option to stop. School became a place where I tried to act normal. I smiled when needed, spoke when needed, but no one knew that inside me was a battle that never stopped. I no longer worried about what other kids worried about. I worried about whether my family would survive. There were nights I stayed awake, listening to my siblings breathe, wondering if I was strong enough to protect them. I feared failure not for myself, but because if I failed, they would fall too. And that fear became the reason I kept going. Slowly, I understood that life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It pushes you into situations you cannot escape, and you only have two choices: give up or move forward. I chose to move forward, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I couldn't let fear decide my future. I was no longer the child who needed protection. I became the one who protects. And even though the road ahead is still uncertain, I know I've made it this far and I will keep going. If you're listening to this story, remember that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up every time you almost do. And if you're struggling right now, believe that you are stronger than you think. If this story touched you, hit like and subscribe for more meaningful stories. Comment below, I will rise, if you believe you can overcome anything. Fear doesn't come once and disappear. It stays. It shows up in every moment when you wake up and realize nothing is the same anymore when you look around and no one is there. I learned that feeling at 11 years old. After the accident, my life didn't just change. It became something completely unfamiliar. I no longer knew what normal meant. Every day was a new challenge, and I had no preparation for any of it. But the hardest part wasn't the things I had to do, it was what I felt inside. A quiet fear that never left. I was afraid of failing, afraid I wasn't good enough to keep my family together, afraid that one day everything would fall apart and I wouldn't be able to stop it. But I couldn't let that fear control me. Because every time I looked at my siblings, I knew they were scared too, but they believed in me. And that belief became stronger than my fear. In the beginning, I tried to do everything perfectly. I thought if I did everything right, if I didn't make mistakes, everything would be okay. But I quickly realized that was impossible. I made mistakes. I fell. There were days I felt like I couldn't go on. But what mattered wasn't that I didn't fail. It was that I didn't stop. School became a place where I hid who I really was. I smiled when needed, talked when needed, but no one knew I was fighting fear every single day. I couldn't share it with anyone, because I was afraid that saying it out loud would make it more real, more terrifying. So I kept it all inside. There were nights I stayed awake listening to every small sound in the house, as if expecting something bad to happen. I couldn't sleep not because I wasn't tired, but because I was afraid to let go. It felt like if I stopped even for a moment, everything would collapse. But over time, I learned something. Fear doesn't disappear. It never fully goes away. But you can learn to live with it. You can keep moving forward even when it's still there. I didn't become fearless. I just became strong enough not to let fear stop me. I was no longer the child I once was, but I wasn't fully an adult either. I was someone learning to face things I should never have had to face. And the only thing that carried me through was love. Love for my family, for the ones who were still there. If you're listening to this story, remember that everyone has their own fears. But what matters isn't whether you're afraid, it's what you do when you are. And sometimes, just by continuing to move forward, no matter how slowly, you are stronger than you think. When you're forced into a life you're not ready for, do you stop or keep moving forward knowing there's no way back? There are things in life you don't choose but still have to live with. For me, it was responsibility that came too early when I was only 11. After the accident, everything changed so fast, I couldn't process what was happening. One day, I was a normal child. The next, I became the one responsible for my entire family. There was no time to prepare, no chance to refuse. Only reality, that I had to keep going. The first days felt like I was living in a world that didn't belong to me. Everything was too big, too difficult, too unfamiliar. I had to learn how to do things I had never been taught, from cooking and cleaning to making decisions that should have been made by adults. There were moments I asked myself why I had to carry all of this, why a child had to take responsibility for things they didn't cause. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that question wouldn't change anything. I couldn't go back. I could only move forward. School became a place where I no longer felt like I belonged. I sat in class looking around, realizing that others were still living in a different world, a world I had already left behind. I no longer thought like them, no longer worried about the same things. I carried things they had never faced. There were days I felt exhausted, not just from work, but from the constant pressure. I wanted to rest, to have a day where I didn't have to think about anything, but I didn't have that luxury. Because if I stopped, everything would stop with me. The only thing that kept me going was my siblings. They didn't expect perfection. They just needed me to be there. And sometimes that alone was enough to make me stand up one more time. Slowly, I learned that responsibility isn't always fair. Some people carry more than others, not because they are stronger, but because circumstances force them to. I didn't become strong overnight. I just learned not to give up. I was no longer the child I once was, but I wasn't fully an adult either. I was someone trying to live a life I didn't choose. And even though this path isn't easy, I keep going because I know there's no turning back. If you're listening to this story, remember that some people are carrying burdens they never chose. And if your life feels difficult, remember, you are not alone. What matters isn't where you start, but whether you have the courage to keep going. I didn't choose this life. No one asked if I was ready. It just happened fast, sudden, and without giving me a chance to turn back. At 11 years old, I was supposed to worry about small things, but instead I had to face challenges that even adults struggle with. The accident took my parents, and with them, the sense of safety I once had. But the hardest part wasn't the loss, it was everything that came after. There was no one left to ask, no one to rely on, no one to take care of things. Just me and responsibilities I couldn't refuse. The first days felt like a massive wave crashing over me. I tried to stand, but everything was overwhelming. I didn't know where to start or what to do first, but then I saw my siblings. They didn't say much, but their eyes told me everything they needed me. And from that moment, I had no choice but to move forward. I started with the smallest things. A simple meal. A clean room a day. Where nothing went wrong. Things I never thought about before became my biggest goals. I stopped thinking about the distant future. I only thought about today. How to make it through today. How to make sure tomorrow wouldn't be worse. School became a place where I had to act normal. I sat in class, listened, took notes. But my mind was always somewhere else. I thought about unfinished tasks, about things I still had to do. It felt like I was living two lives. One that people saw, and one only I knew. There were moments I wanted to stop, to admit I couldn't do it, to have someone come and tell me I didn't have to carry everything. But there was no one, and that's what kept me going. Slowly, I learned that strength isn't always what people think it is. Sometimes it's just not giving up. It's continuing even when every step feels heavy. I didn't become perfect. I still made mistakes, still felt fear, still had moments where I wanted to quit, but I didn't stop. And maybe that's what matters most. I was no longer the child I once was, but I wasn't fully an adult either. I was someone doing the best I could in a life I didn't choose. And if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this. You don't have to be perfect to keep going. You just have to not give up. If you're listening to this story, understand that there are people fighting battles every day that no one sees. And if you're fighting too, believe that every small step you take matters, because sometimes just moving forward is already a victory. There are days I still ask myself, if none of this had happened, would I be living a completely different life? But then I realize that question doesn't change anything, because the truth is at 11, I lost the only place where I ever felt safe. The accident took my parents, and with them everything I depended on. It all happened so fast that I couldn't even process what was going on. One day I was still a carefree child. The next I was facing a world I wasn't ready for. The hardest part wasn't what I had to do. It was what I felt inside. An emptiness that nothing could fill. No one calling my name in the morning, no one asking if I had eaten, no one telling me everything would be okay. And that silence made me realize that from now on I had to do everything on my own. The first days were filled with uncertainty. I didn't know what I was doing, I was just trying to keep everything from falling apart. I cooked without knowing how, cleaned without knowing where to start, tried to make my siblings feel safe, even though I was terrified. There were moments I stood in the house, looking around, feeling too small for everything happening, but I couldn't stop. Because if I stopped, no one else would continue. School became a place where I tried to look normal. I sat in class, listened, but my mind was always back home. I thought about my siblings, about the things I needed to do, about responsibilities I had never faced before. I no longer felt like I belonged there. It felt like I had been pushed into a different world, a world where I had to survive on my own. There were nights I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of loneliness. Not loneliness, because no one was around, but because there was no one left to carry the burden for me. I was afraid of the future, afraid of things I couldn't control. But then I realized I didn't need to know everything. I just needed to get through today. And then tomorrow. One day at a time. Slowly I learned to stand strong. Not because I wasn't afraid anymore, but because I no longer let fear stop me. I learned to accept that life isn't fair, but I could still keep going. I was no longer the child who needed protection. I became the one who protects myself and my family. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. You can lose everything, but as long as you keep going, you haven't truly lost. If you're listening to this story, remember that some people have had to stand on their own when no one was left. And if you feel lost, believe that as long as you don't stop, you are still moving forward. I don't remember the last time I felt carefree. Maybe it was before that day, the day everything changed forever. When the accident happened, I didn't just lose my parents. I lost my right to be a child. No more playing freely, no more peaceful sleep, no more feeling that someone was always there to protect me. All of that disappeared, replaced by something I was never ready for: responsibility. In the first days, I kept hoping it was all just a nightmare. I thought I would wake up and everything would go back to normal, but every morning reminded me that it wouldn't, and I was forced to accept the truth: I had to grow up right now. There was no time to prepare, no one to teach me how. I had to learn everything on my own, from small things like cooking and doing laundry to bigger things, like taking care of my siblings and holding the family together. There were moments I felt like I couldn't do it. I looked at myself and saw a child trying to do an adult's job. I made mistakes. I panicked. I had days where I just wanted to give up. But every time I looked at my siblings, the way they smiled, the way they trusted me, the way they depended on me as if I was everything they had left, and that made it impossible for me to stop. School was no longer a place I could relax. I sat in class, but my mind was somewhere else. I thought about everything that needed to be done, everything I couldn't delay. I began to understand that life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It moves forward whether you keep up or not. And you only have two choices: get left behind or keep going. I chose to keep going, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I couldn't let fear stop me. Slowly, I stopped trying to be a child again. I accepted that my childhood ended early, but instead of letting it destroy me, I used it to become stronger. I didn't become perfect. I was still afraid, still tired, still had moments where I wanted to quit, but I kept going, and maybe that's what matters most. I was no longer the child I once was, but I became the person my family needed. And if I had to choose again, I would still choose to stand up for them. If you're listening to this story, remember that some people had to give up their childhood to keep their family together. And if you still have the chance to live carefree, cherish it. But if you're fighting your own battles, believe that you are stronger than you think. When everything around you collapses, what do you do when two small lives are depending on you to stay strong? I don't remember the exact sound of that day, but I remember the feeling. An emptiness so deep, it made everything feel distant. The accident took my parents, leaving behind a void nothing could fill. But I didn't have time to fully process that pain, because right in front of me were my two younger siblings, small, scared, and completely dependent on me. In that moment, I understood that if I fell apart, they would too, and I couldn't let that happen. The first days felt like walking through debris. Every step hurt, every decision was difficult. I didn't know if I was doing anything right. I just knew I had to keep going. I learned to cook simple meals, to keep the house from falling into chaos, to say everything will be okay even when I didn't believe it. There were moments I stood alone in the kitchen, hands shaking from exhaustion and fear, but I kept going. Because if I stopped, who would take my place? School became a place where I had to hide everything. I sat in class trying to focus, but my mind was always at home. I thought about my siblings, whether they were okay, about the things I hadn't finished. I began to understand that life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It moves forward, and you have to keep up. There were nights I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to my siblings breathe, wondering how long I could keep this going. I feared failure, not for myself, but because if I failed, they would have no one. And that fear kept me moving. Slowly, I learned to keep going even without any guarantee things would get better. I learned to accept that I would make mistakes, that I would have weak days. But I also learned that what matters isn't whether you're perfect, it's whether you keep going. I was no longer the child I once was, but I wasn't fully an adult either. I was someone trying to keep everything from falling apart one day at a time. And if there's one thing I truly understand, it's this: sometimes you don't stay strong for yourself. You stay strong for the people who need you. If you're listening to this story, remember that there are people out there who keep going, even when everything around them has collapsed. And if you're facing your own struggles, believe that as long as you don't stop, you are stronger than you think. If this story made you think, hit like and subscribe for more meaningful stories. Comment below. I will keep going if you believe you can push forward no matter what. I used to believe that someone was always there behind me, that no matter how hard I fell, there would be a hand to pull me back up. But everything changed the day the accident happened. At 11 years old, I didn't just lose my parents. I lost the feeling of being protected. From that moment, I knew there was no one left behind me. And that was more terrifying than anything I had ever experienced. The first days felt like I wasn't living, just existing. Everything moved like a dream I couldn't wake up from. I looked around, hoping someone would walk in and tell me everything would be okay. But no one came. There was only me and my two younger siblings, small, quiet, and waiting. And in their eyes, I saw one thing clearly: I had to stand up. Not because I was ready, but because I was the only one left. I started doing things I had never imagined. I cooked without knowing how, cleaned without knowing where to start. Tried to keep everything under control, even when I was falling apart inside. There were moments I stood still in the house, feeling like I couldn't go on. But then, I heard my siblings call me, and I knew I couldn't stop. School became a place where I had to act normal. I sat in class, listened, but my mind was always somewhere else. I thought about unfinished tasks, about what I had to do when I got home. I was no longer a child like the others. I carried things they had never faced. There were nights I stayed awake, not because I wasn't tired, but because I was afraid to let go. I feared that if I stopped, even for a moment, everything would collapse. I feared I wasn't strong enough to hold it all together. But then I realized I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to keep going. One step at a time. Slowly, I learned that not everyone gets saved. Sometimes you have to save yourself. And when you do, you are no longer the same person. You become stronger not because you are fearless, but because you've learned to move forward despite fear. I was no longer the child who needed support. I became the one who stands on my own. And if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this. You may think you're not strong enough, but when there's no one else, you will find a strength you never knew you had. If you're listening to this, believe that even if you're alone, you can still move forward. And sometimes, just by not stopping, you've already won. I never thought I would have to stand against the world. But when the accident happened, I realized the world doesn't stop just because you're hurting. It keeps moving, cold, indifferent, and unaware of what you've lost. At 11 years old, I didn't just lose my parents, I lost my only support system. And in that moment, I understood that if I didn't stand up, no one else would do it for me. The first days felt like I had been pushed outside of life itself. Everything around me kept going up, but I was stuck in a completely different reality. I watched people live their normal lives and realized mine would never be the same again. But I didn't have time to dwell on it because I had two siblings who needed me. They didn't need me to be perfect. They just needed me not to give up. And that became my reason to keep going. I started learning how to face each day. Not with confidence, but with persistence. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had to get through today. I cooked even when I was clumsy, cleaned even when I was exhausted, did everything I could to keep things from falling apart. There were moments I felt like I was fighting alone, like the world was too big and I was too small. But then I looked at my siblings, the way they trusted me, the way they relied on me, without question, and I realized I wasn't truly alone. I had a reason to keep going. School became a place where I had to hold myself together. I couldn't let anyone see me weak, because I feared that if I admitted it, I might not be able to stand back up. I carried all my fears and pressure, but I kept moving forward. There were nights I wondered how long I could keep going. I feared that one day I wouldn't have the strength anymore. But then I realized I didn't need to know how far I could go. I just needed to take one more step, and then another. Slowly, I understood that standing against the world doesn't mean defeating everything. Sometimes, it simply means not giving up. It means standing firm when everything around you tries to pull you down. I didn't become fearless. I just became someone who refuses to quit. And if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this: you don't have to defeat the world. You just have to not let it defeat you. If you're listening to this story, believe that even when it feels like you're against everything, you can still move forward. And sometimes the only reason you need is the people you love. If this story made you think, hit like and subscribe to share more powerful stories. Comment below, I won't give up, if you believe you can keep going, no matter how hard life gets. When you know that stopping even for a moment means everything will fall apart. How far will you keep going? There are pressures you can't share, can't put down, and can't escape. For me, that pressure began at 11 years old. After the accident, my life was no longer just mine. Every decision I made, every action I took, affected my two younger siblings who depended entirely on me. And from that moment, I understood that I no longer had the right to stop. The first days felt like being thrown into a race I never signed up for. I was pushed into it with no preparation, no guidance. I only knew that if I slowed down, everything would fall behind. I learned to do everything quickly, cook clean, take care of my siblings, and keep everything from collapsing into chaos. There were moments I was so exhausted I could barely stand, but I had to keep going. Because if I fell, no one would take my place. School became a place where I couldn't truly be present. I sat in class, but my mind was always ahead, thinking about what needed to be done, what problems needed solving. I no longer had time to worry about the small things my peers did. I was living at a different pace. I couldn't slow down. There were nights I felt like I couldn't breathe. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight on my shoulders. I wanted to rest, to have just one day, where I didn't have to think about anything. But I didn't have that choice, because I knew that if I stopped even for a day, everything would begin to crack, and I couldn't let that happen. The only thing that kept me going was my siblings. Not because they demanded strength, but because their existence made it impossible for me to be weak. I saw them every day, and I knew I had to continue. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. Slowly, I learned to live with pressure, not by removing it, but by accepting it as part of me. I stopped looking for an easy way out. I focused on moving forward, one step at a time. No matter how slow, no matter how tired, I didn't stop. I was no longer the child I once was, but I wasn't fully an adult either. I was someone trying to keep everything from breaking apart. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: sometimes you don't have to run faster. You just have to not stop. If you're listening to this story, remember that there are people carrying their entire world on their shoulders, yet they keep moving forward. And if you're feeling overwhelmed, believe that as long as you don't give up, you are still moving ahead. If this story touched you, hit like and subscribe for more meaningful content. Comment below, I won't stop, if you believe you can keep going no matter what. You can lose everything. But the real question is, will you lose yourself, or will you rise and rewrite the ending? When everything happened, I thought my life was over. Not in the sense of dying, but in the sense that everything that once defined me, family, safety, the future, was gone. At 11 years old, I stood in a space I couldn't understand. I didn't know who I would become, or if I could make it through. But there was one thing I didn't realize at the time. Even after losing so much, I still had myself. In the beginning, I was just trying to survive. I didn't think far ahead, didn't dream big dreams. I just wanted my siblings to eat, to sleep, to feel safe. I did everything I could, even when I didn't know if I was doing it right. I made mistakes. I was afraid. There were nights I thought I couldn't go on. But every morning I got up again. Not because I was stronger than the day before, but because I had no other choice. As time passed, I began to realize something. I wasn't just surviving, I was changing. I was no longer the weak child I thought I was. I learned to endure, to decide, to stand without anyone beside me. And even though I never chose this path, it shaped me into someone I never imagined I could be. There were moments I looked back and wondered, who would I be if none of this had happened? Maybe my life would have been easier. maybe I wouldn't have carried all this weight. But I also realized that these experiences made me who I am today. Not perfect, not strong in the way people expect, but someone who doesn't give up. The most important thing isn't what I lost, it's what I kept. I kept my family together. I kept my love for my siblings. And most importantly, I kept myself. I didn't let pain turn me into someone else. I didn't let circumstances decide who I would become. I chose to keep going. I chose to stand. And I chose not to quit. If you're listening to this story, remember that life can take many things from you. But it cannot take who you are unless you let it. You may fall. You may feel exhausted, but you can still rise. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't achieving something big, it's simply not giving up when everything gets hardest. If this story moved, you hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Comment below, I won't lose myself, if you believe you can rise, no matter how hard life gets. There's a truth no one wants to admit: life can take everything from you in a single moment. No warning, no preparation, no chance to say goodbye. I learned that the hard way. There was a time when I thought I had everything: a family, a clear future, a path I believed I would follow to the end. And then it was all gone so fast I couldn't even process what was happening. When you hit rock bottom, it doesn't feel like the movies. There's no dramatic music, no emotional climax. Just silence. A void so deep you don't know how to fill it. I remember the first days after everything collapsed. I didn't cry as much as I thought I would. I just sat there looking at everything around me, asking, what do I do now? No one answered. No one came to tell me everything would be okay. And that's when I realized something: no one was coming to save me. If I wanted to get out of this, I had to do it myself. But the first step is always the hardest. When you're at the bottom, you have no motivation, no belief, not even the certainty that you have the strength to stand up. There were days when getting out of bed felt like a battle. I thought about giving up, thinking maybe I wasn't strong enough to change anything. But then something small kept me going, a simple thought: if I'm already at the bottom, I have nothing left to lose. And from that moment, I started moving. Not big steps, just very small ones. A little more effort than yesterday. One more decision not to quit. One more time standing up after falling. No one applauded. No one saw it. But those small steps changed everything. I began to understand that strength isn't something you're born with. It's built slowly through the days you don't want to continue, but do anyway. There were still moments I doubted myself, still feared failure. But this time I didn't let fear stop me. I accepted that I would make mistakes, have bad days. But I also understood that as long as I didn't stop, I was still moving forward. Over time, I wasn't the same person who had hit rock bottom. Not because life got easier, but because I changed. I stopped looking for a perfect path. I just needed a path to keep going. And when I looked back, I realized that rock bottom wasn't the end. It was the beginning. A place where you are forced to face yourself, forced to choose who you want to become. You can stay there and accept everything, or you can stand up and rewrite your story. And if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this: hitting rock bottom is not failure. The real failure is deciding not to get back up. If you're going through a hard time, remember you don't have to fix everything in one day. You just have to start. One small step, one decision not to quit. And step by step, you'll climb out of the place you once thought you could never escape. Because sometimes, the greatest strength isn't how fast you move, it's simply that you don't stop. Strength doesn't always come from feeling powerful. Sometimes it comes from your weakest moments, when you feel like you can't go on, but you do anyway. This isn't about big victories. It's about those moments when you're on the edge of quitting, but you don't stop. I've been there. A place where everything feels overwhelming. You look at your life and ask, why should I keep going? And honestly, sometimes there is no clear answer. No big goal, no dream, strong enough to pull you up. Just exhaustion, doubt, and the feeling that you've tried so hard without getting anywhere. There were days I woke up, and the only thing I wanted was to go back to sleep, just to avoid facing another day. Moments when everything I did felt pointless. I looked around and saw others moving forward while I felt stuck. And in those moments, giving up felt real. Not just a passing thought, but a lingering voice saying, stop. You've done enough. But here's what no one tells you. You don't need all the answers to keep going. You don't need to feel strong to move forward. Sometimes all you need is one small reason, something just enough to keep you from stopping right now. For me, some days, that reason was simply, I've made it this far. Not a big reason, but enough to take one more step, and then another. I began to realize that strength isn't a feeling. It's not something you always have. It's a choice, a decision you make, even when you don't want to. You don't have to feel ready. You just have to not stop. There were still moments I doubted myself, still feared that I might never reach where I wanted to be. But this time, I didn't let those thoughts control my actions. I learned to separate feelings from actions. I could feel tired, but still act. I could feel afraid, but still move. And over time, those small steps began to create change. Not instantly, but enough to show me that I was moving forward. The most important thing I learned is this: you don't have to be perfect to continue. You don't have to be strong all the time. You just have to not quit in your hardest moments. Because those are the moments where real strength is built. When no one sees you, when no one is cheering, when you're alone, and you still choose to move forward. If you're in a place where you feel like giving up, remember, you don't have to fix everything right now. You just have to get through today. Just one more step. Just don't stop. And day by day, you'll look back and realize you've come farther than you ever thought possible. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't to win, it's simply to not give up. When people think about success, they often imagine big turning points, explosive moments, overnight transformations. But the truth is, most people who go the farthest are not the ones who explode. They're the ones who never stop. Quiet strength doesn't make noise. It doesn't get attention, applause, or recognition. But it exists day after day, in small actions that most people overlook. I used to believe that if I didn't achieve something big, my efforts didn't matter. I looked around and saw successful people's standout stories, and wondered why I couldn't be like them. What I didn't see were their ordinary days, the days they were tired, doubtful, yet kept going. And then I realized the difference isn't in the big moments. It's in the days no one sees. The days you have no motivation, but still act. The days you want to quit but keep going. The days you're not sure if you're on the right path, but you don't turn back. Quiet strength is when you don't need recognition to continue. You don't need encouragement to move forward. You just need a reason not to stop. There were days I felt like I wasn't making progress at all. I repeated the same tasks, saw no immediate results, no visible change. And that made me doubt myself. But then I realized that progress isn't always visible. It's like building a foundation. You don't see the structure right away, but every small brick contributes to something bigger. I started focusing on small things, getting a little better each day, trying a little harder each time. Not perfection, just improvement. And over time, those small efforts began to add up. Not loudly, not quickly, but surely. There were still moments I felt behind. Watching others achieve big success, I questioned whether my path was right. But then I remembered that everyone moves at their own pace. And just because you're slower doesn't mean you're wrong. Quiet strength is when you stop comparing your journey to others. You focus only on becoming a better version of yourself. I didn't become someone new overnight. I didn't have a single breakthrough moment that changed everything. But I had hundreds, thousands of small moments when I chose to continue instead of quitting. And those moments shaped who I am today. If you feel like you're not fast enough, not good enough, not standing out, remember, you don't need to be. You just need to not stop. You just need to keep going, even when no one is watching. Because in the end, the ones who go the farthest are not the fastest. They're the ones who never quit. And if you're still moving, no matter how slow you are, still moving forward,